King Charles has honoured his brother Prince Edward in a most royal manner on his birthday. Fittingly, the King's younger brother was in Scotland on the day a new title was bestowed upon him, one that comes with the responsibility of continuing their late father Prince Philip's work with young people around the globe.
So, Prince Edward just pulled off the ultimate insider coup, and the rest of the royal family is absolutely furious. On March 25th, 2026, King Charles III received a confidential legal dossier that completely shattered his authority. In writing, black and white, Edward's lawyers officially confirmed that his quiet, overlooked younger brother inherits the exact fortune and property Charles had been desperately trying to deny him for years. Think about the absolute shockwave that sent through Buckingham Palace. For years, Charles had been operating under a wild, arrogant assumption. He believed that as king, he owned the entire realm. He thought he could reorganize royal assets, rewrite private leases, and strip family members of their historic properties whenever he felt like it. On that quiet spring afternoon, he found out he was dead wrong. What makes this whole situation so deeply embarrassing for the king isn't just that he lost, it's how he lost. Edward didn't just win a feud, he exposed a fundamental flaw at the very top of the British monarchy about what a king actually can and cannot do. And he did it by being the one person in the family who quietly kept every single receipt. Silence is a dangerous thing. For decades, Edward played the role of the steady, invisible brother. He stayed out of the tabloids. He did the grueling public duties. He never caused a public scandal. But while the palace treated him like a background player, Edward was taking notes. He was filing documents. He was building an ironclad legal fortress behind closed doors. The real story starts long before this court fight began. It goes back to Queen Elizabeth II. In the final years before her death in September 2022, the late Queen saw the writing on the wall. She watched the family dynamics fracture. She saw the subtle power struggles brewing between her sons, and she knew that the moment she drew her last breath, the wolves inside the palace would move. She knew Charles wanted to modernize the monarchy, but she also knew what that word really meant in practice. Consolidation. Cutting off the younger siblings, reclaiming assets, centralizing power. So, Elizabeth made a series of calculated, cold decisions. Decisions designed to protect her youngest son before she was gone. The Dukedom of Edinburgh was always meant for Prince Edward. That was never up for debate inside the royal household. For more than 70 years, that historic title defined Prince Philip. It was his entire life's work. Elizabeth made sure it would pass to the one son who stayed loyal, stayed quiet, and never brought harm to the crown. That promise seemed to be honored in April 2023, when King Charles officially handed Edward the dukedom. The public saw the photographs and thought the matter was settled. They thought it was a touching moment of family unity, a brother honoring his late father's legacy. It was all an illusion, a public relations smokescreen. Because while Charles was handing Edward the title in front of the cameras, palace aides behind closed doors were already drawing up plans to strip away everything that gave that title real power. Hi viewers, if you were in Prince Edward's shoes, would you have surrendered your home to keep the peace, or fought the king? Type surrender or fight in the comments below, right now. What the public didn't realize, and what Charles completely overlooked, was that the title of Duke was only half of what Elizabeth left for Edward. A title on paper is just a hollow name. It carries no real weight without an asset to back it up. The second half of that inheritance was Bagshot Park, a sprawling 120-room Tudor Gothic estate sitting on 51 acres inside Windsor Great Park. It is the historic seat of the dukedom, and in her final days, Elizabeth signed a confidential letter of intent that locked Bagshot Park directly to Edward's title for life. That document wasn't signed in secret by just anyone. It was witnessed by Prince Philip as he lay dying. Philip had spent over 7 decades inside the royal machine. He knew how efficiently the palace bureaucracy could destroy someone once they were no longer deemed useful. He knew Edward would need legal protection when the pressure came, so Philip put his own signature on that document. But after the Queen died, the mindset inside Buckingham Palace shifted instantly. Charles believed his mandate to streamline the royal family gave him absolute authority over royal real estate. By 2026, financial audits were launched. Leases were placed under review. Pressure was quietly applied behind closed doors to force Edward out of Bagshot Park. The hypocrisy was staggering. Edward received the dukedom in 2023 after waiting his entire life. He watched his father carry that title with pride. He stepped into the role, and within 3 years, the same institution that gave him the title began trying to strip away the very home that gave it meaning. They wanted to weaken him. Without Bagshot Park, the Dukedom of Edinburgh becomes an empty name, just a title without a base, just an office without power. Charles thought Edward would back down. He assumed a younger brother wouldn't dare challenge the reigning king. He expected Edward to surrender the keys, accept a smaller property, and keep quiet for the sake of the institution. Charles made a catastrophic mistake. He forgot that Edward is not like the rest of the family. Edward doesn't panic. He doesn't go to the press. He goes to his lawyers. By the morning of March 25th, 2026, the quiet negotiations were over. Edward's legal team delivered a confidential dossier directly to the king's desk. It contained every contract, every signed covenant, every financial record from the last 28 years. Charles sat in his office reading documents that proved his mother and father had outsmarted him years before he ever took the throne. Every legal loophole Charles thought he could exploit had already been closed. The title was only half of what Edward inherited, and now the rest of the truth was coming to light. The palace thought they had Edward cornered on a simple real estate technicality. They were completely blind to the devastating legal trap Edward had set for them over 2 decades ago. A trap that was about to turn the entire royal family upside down. When I pulled the historic financial audits for Bagshot Park, I expected to find a luxury gift. I expected a royal handout. I was wrong. The paper trail tells a completely different story. It tells the story of an abandoned money pit that nobody in the royal orbit actually wanted. In 1996, the Royal Army Chaplains Department packed up their bags and walked out. They left behind a sprawling, decaying Tudor Gothic nightmare. 120 rooms, 51 acres of overgrown terrain inside Windsor Great Park, rotting timber, outdated heating, decades of institutional neglect. The Crown Estate didn't even consider keeping it as an official royal residence. They wanted out. They were making active plans to turn the property into a commercial hotel or a private conference center. That is how low its value had fallen. It was an expensive liability. Then came March 1998. The palace made Prince Edward an offer. But it wasn't a gift. It was a burden wrapped in a contract. The terms seemed deceptively simple on paper. A 50-year lease at £5,000 a year. Sounds cheap, doesn't it? That is what the critics always jump on. But look closer at Clause 4. The low rent came with an immediate, crushing condition. Edward had to repair the entire estate. Not over time, not gradually, immediately, out of his own pocket. And he did. He didn't ask Parliament for a tax handout. He didn't beg the Treasury. Edward took £1.36 million of his own private earnings, money he had made himself before becoming a full-time working royal, and poured every single penny straight into the ground. The total cost of the structural restoration reached nearly £3 million. The Crown estate covered a portion, but Edward carried the heavy financial load himself. He fixed the roofs, he modernized the plumbing, he saved a historic structure from collapsing into rubble. And how did the institution reward him? The moment the heavy construction was finished, they hiked his rent. They raised it to £90,000 every single year. Let that sink in. £90,000 a year for his own home. The National Audit Office stepped in to review the lease. They formally confirmed that £90,000 was strict market value. Edward accepted it. He paid it without a single public complaint. Year after year, decades of quiet, documented compliance. But here is the detail that made my blood run cold during this investigation. Compare Edward's receipts to how his brother operated. Look at Prince Andrew. Andrew lived at Royal Lodge for years. Millions spent, yet he never paid a true market rate for his property. The National Audit Office documented the discrepancies. One brother followed every single rule, paid his own way, and built security through honest investment. The other brother relied on financial favors and palace protection. Yet in 2026, when King Charles started sweeping through royal properties with his audit clipboard, who did the system turn its sights on? Not the brother who broke the rules. They targeted the brother who did everything right. Why? Because Bagshot Park was no longer a rotting liability. It had become a financial goldmine. By 2007, Edward saw the political wind changing inside the family. He knew how fragile royal housing security really was, so he made a quiet, brilliant financial move. He didn't rely on verbal promises from his family. He formed a private entity called Eclipse Nominees Limited. Through that company, Edward paid £5 million in cash to extend his lease to 150 years. Think about what that move accomplished. 150 years. That single transaction gave him full legal control over the property. It gave him the explicit legal right to sell the lease on the open market and retain the profit. He built a fortress. He built absolute security. By the time March 2026 rolled around, that once decaying Tudor mansion was officially valued at approximately £30 million. 30 million! Now the real motive reveals itself. When palace officials started applying pressure on Edward to give up Bagshot Park, it had nothing to do with modernizing the monarchy. That was just a convenient story for the press. The financial motive was sitting right there in plain sight. Reclaim a £30 million asset, flip the lease, and funnel the profits back into central control. It was a takeover, dressed up as reform. They thought Edward was an easy target. They forgot about his father. Prince Philip had spent over 70 years observing the cold inner workings of Buckingham Palace. He knew how the institution treated family members once their immediate usefulness expired. He had seen people pushed to the margins, stripped of their security, and left with nothing. Philip was determined that his youngest son would never suffer that fate. In his final months, as his health was fading, Philip did something extraordinary. He personally signed and witnessed a legal letter of intent directly connecting Bagshot Park to the Dukedom of Edinburgh for Edward's entire lifetime. He put his legal name on a document specifically engineered to make a palace eviction impossible. When King Charles's lawyers opened Edward's confidential legal dossier on March 25, 2026, they didn't just find a lease, they found 3 unassailable pillars of defense. First, the original 1998 lease, proving massive private financial investment. Second, the 2007 lease extension confirming a paid-in-full 150-year legal right, and third, a signed covenant witnessed by Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth II, explicitly binding the estate to Edward's title. The King's legal team realized the brutal reality in seconds. The Crown estate couldn't touch Bagshot Park. The £30 million asset was completely, utterly out of their legal reach. Edward had won the real estate war before it even started. Charles was completely defeated on paper. His lawyers told him to stand down on the property. But inside the palace, losing a power play only breeds deeper resentment. When powerful people realize they cannot break you legally, they change the rules of engagement. They stop attacking your assets. They start attacking the people you love. Having realized they could not steal Edward's home, the institution quietly turned its sights toward his wife, Sophie. They initiated a dark, underhanded administrative raid, a quiet audit designed to strip away the one priceless personal treasure Sophie had carried for 25 years. And what happened when officials showed up at Sophie's doorstep with a clipboard and an order from Queen Camilla's office will leave you absolutely speechless. You cannot afford to miss what comes next. In the next video, I will expose the exact confidential documents from the secret jewelry raid, including the stunning wedding gift Queen Elizabeth signed to protect Sophie, and the explosive threat Prince Edward dropped on the palace that threatened to destroy Queen Camilla's public image forever. Subscribe right now, turn on your notifications, and click the video on your screen immediately, because the truth about the Anthem Tiara audit is about to drop. When a powerful institution fails to seize your home, they do not simply pack up and walk away. They pivot. They look for softer targets. They look for emotional vulnerabilities. That is precisely what happened inside Buckingham Palace after the real estate assault on Bagshot Park hit a dead end. The defeat on paper was embarrassing for the King's advisors. But inside royal corridors, embarrassment rapidly turns into quiet malice. If you cannot break a man through contract law, you break him through his family. You target his wife. Early in 2026, long before the final legal dossier landed on Charles's desk, an official arrived at the Edinburgh household. He carried a leather-bound clipboard and a set of quiet, formal instructions. The visit was framed as a routine administrative matter, a national heritage check, a central inventory update. That was the public relation cover story. The reality? It was an administrative ambush, and the orders came directly from the office of Queen Camilla. The official was there to inspect, count, and question a specific piece of treasure, a piece that Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, had worn as her own for more than 25 years. At the absolute center of this sudden audit was the Anthem Tiara. This was not just another random piece of ice sitting in a dusty velvet tray inside the central vaults. It was personal. It was commissioned specifically for Sophie by Queen Elizabeth II for her wedding in 1999. Royal jewelers constructed the piece using 4 distinct antique honeysuckle elements, taken directly from the private collection of Queen Victoria. For nearly 2 decades, that tiara was the only crown Sophie ever wore in public. Think about what that means. Other senior royal women were routinely handed open access to the grand state vaults. They were given iconic pieces studded with massive diamonds and centuries of historic weight. Sophie was not. That detail was understood inside the family, even if nobody said it out loud. She was deliberately kept at a lower position. She was never placed at the center of palace glamour. The Anthem Tiara was her one piece, her wedding crown, her single symbol of royal status. Take that piece away, and you leave her with literally nothing. Camilla's legal team constructed a cold, technical argument. They wrapped their demands in dense heritage language. Because the tiara incorporated gold and stones originally belonging to Queen Victoria, they argued it must be reclassified as crown property. It should no longer sit in a private safe at Bagshot Park. It belonged in the central royal vault at Buckingham Palace. The true meaning behind that legal maneuver was ruthless. Sophie would no longer own the crown she wore down the aisle on her wedding day. She would be forced to submit written requests to palace officials whenever she wished to wear it. Permission could be granted, or permission could be quietly denied. It was a power play, designed to put Sophie in her place. Look at the terrifying precedent that logic creates. If the palace can reclassify a wedding gift based on where the raw materials originated, no item is safe. It opens the door to legally reclaim dozens of personal gifts handed out by Queen Elizabeth II over her 70-year reign. It reaches across every branch of the family. And here is the dark irony that Camilla's team completely overlooked. The exact same logic turns right back around on Camilla herself. Her own personal jewelry collection came directly from royal sources and historical transfers. Apply that strict standard to her vaults, and her private collection falls into the exact same trap. The public has seen this cold pattern before. We know how this game is played. Cast your mind back to what happened after Princess Diana died in 1997. Diana had been given a stunning diamond and emerald cabochon necklace by the Queen Mother on her wedding day in 1981. It was a personal gift. Yet after her tragic death, the necklace was quietly retrieved and locked back inside the central royal vault. That should have been the end of the story. But years later, Camilla had that exact piece pulled from the vault. She had Diana's wedding necklace redesigned into a brooch, and then she wore it publicly to a royal event. The public reaction was immediate and furious. People were outraged. They saw it as a deliberate, cold insult to Diana's memory. That dark memory never truly faded from the public consciousness. And now, in early 2026, the exact same machine was grinding into motion again. They were reaching into something deeply personal, using administrative power to rewrite history. They expected Prince Edward to remain passive. They assumed he would let the audit happen to avoid a public scandal. They were wrong. Edward didn't panic. He struck back with legal surgical precision. When the auditors pressed their claim, Edward's legal team produced a confidential document from 1999 that stopped them cold. It was an official deed of gift, personally signed by Queen Elizabeth II. The deed explicitly stated that the anthem tiara was classified as a private wedding present to Sophie, not a state loan, not a central asset, private property. Elizabeth had also personally bestowed the Royal Victorian Order upon Sophie. That honor is not handed out by government ministers or palace committees. It is given directly by the monarch for personal, devoted service to the sovereign. Elizabeth made her stance crystal clear. She trusted Sophie. She protected Sophie. Edward was not finished. He revealed a second layer of defense that no one in the palace saw coming. Back in 1999, Edward had personally worked alongside master jewelers to commission a bespoke set of black and white pearl jewelry for Sophie, a necklace and matching earrings designed specifically to complement the anthem tiara. While the materials were processed through official channels, Edward held the private design copyright for that set. His lawyers presented a devastating legal argument. The tiara and the matching pearl set constituted a single, indivisible artistic unit. Because Edward owned the artistic design rights, the palace could not remove or alter the tiara without violating Edward's intellectual property rights. It was a brilliant, ironclad trap. Underneath the legal warfare, sat a deeply human bond. Sophie had lost her own mother at a young age. Over the decades, Queen Elizabeth II became the closest thing she had to a mother. In October 2019, during a speech at Buckingham Palace, Sophie accidentally let her guard down. Looking directly at the late Queen, she referred to her as Mama in front of a crowded room. It was an unscripted moment of pure emotional truth. The woman who signed that 1999 deed of gift was the woman Sophie loved like a mother. And now, another woman was attempting to erase that legacy. By the afternoon of March 25, 2026, Edward's legal team delivered an uncompromising ultimatum to the King's office. If the claim on the anthem Tiara was not formally dropped by the end of the day, they would release private correspondence written by Queen Elizabeth II, letters that outlined her explicit wishes for Sophie, letters that also contained severe, unvarnished assessments of Camilla herself. The threat was explosive. Releasing those private letters would do far more than defend a tiara. It would drag 30 years of buried palace dirty laundry back into the global spotlight. It would expose the late Queen's long, cold distance toward Camilla. It would destroy decades of carefully crafted public relations work in a single news cycle. Edward had drawn a line in the sand. He had secured the tiara inside a high-security private safe, completely outside palace control. But paper threats were no longer enough. The conflict was about to erupt into a direct, volatile confrontation inside the King's private quarters. And the person stepping into the ring to finish this fight was not Edward. It was Princess Anne. You cannot afford to miss what happens next. In the next video, I will reveal the terrifying face-to-face showdown inside Buckingham Palace, where Princess Anne confronted King Charles with a nuclear threat that left the King speechless. Subscribe immediately, hit the notification bell, and click the video appearing on your screen right now to see how Princess Anne dismantled Queen Camilla's entire operation in less than 10 minutes. By the afternoon of March 25, 2026, the quiet legal maneuvers behind closed doors collapsed into an all-out war inside Buckingham Palace. I watched the timeline of events unfold with startling speed. The palace bureaucracy had expected Prince Edward to bow his head. They assumed he would yield under institutional pressure. They were wrong. Edward didn't send a polite letter of appeal. He sent his legal team. They walked into the palace offices carrying a confidential file that contained decades of undeniable receipts. At the top of that file sat a single document from 1999, a deed of gift. It was personally signed by Queen Elizabeth II on the eve of Edward and Sophie's wedding. The text was crystal clear. It explicitly classified the anthem tiara as a private wedding present to Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. It was not a temporary loan. It was not a shared institutional asset. It was not held in trust for the crown. It belonged directly to Sophie. To reinforce that protection, Elizabeth had also bestowed upon Sophie the Royal Victorian Order. Why does that detail matter? Because the Royal Victorian Order is not awarded by government officials or palace committees. It is granted personally by the ruling monarch for direct, faithful service to the sovereign. Queen Elizabeth had laid down a deliberate paper trail. She wanted the world, and her successor, to know exactly who she trusted. Then came the legal maneuver that completely stunned the King's advisors. Back in 1999, Edward had secretly collaborated with master royal jewelers to design a matching set of black and white pearl jewelry for his new bride. A custom necklace and matching earrings, specifically crafted to pair with the anthem tiara. While the physical materials were processed through official channels, Edward personally retained the legal design rights. His lawyers laid out a devastating copyright argument on the table. The anthem Tiara and the bespoke pearl set formed a single, unified artistic work tied directly to Edward's intellectual property. If the palace attempted to reclassify or seize the tiara, they would be breaking up an indivisible artistic unit and directly violating Edward's private design rights. The palace auditors were trapped. They couldn't move without triggering a massive copyright lawsuit from within the king's own family. Look at the emotional weight behind this legal fight. Sophie had lost her biological mother at a young age. Over 25 years of dedicated service, Queen Elizabeth became her surrogate mother. In October 2019, during a public speech at Buckingham Palace, Sophie turned toward the late Queen and slipped. She called her Mama in front of a room packed with guests and reporters. It was an unscripted, raw moment of maternal love. The woman who signed that 1999 deed of gift was the mother figure Sophie cherished. And now, Queen Camilla's office was attempting to reach into the vault and strip away that precious memory. Edward refused to allow it. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, his legal team issued a firm ultimatum. Drop the audit on the anthem tiara by the end of the day, or face an immediate public release of Queen Elizabeth's private correspondence. Letters written in the late Queen's own hand. What was inside those letters? They contained Elizabeth's explicit, written directives confirming Sophie's permanent ownership of her personal jewelry. But more critically, those letters contained unvarnished, cold statements regarding Queen Camilla. They detailed the late Queen's long distance, her deep hesitation, and the years of internal palace friction before Camilla was ever accepted into the fold. King Charles had spent over 20 years meticulously rebuilding Camilla's public image. He had transformed her from a deeply controversial figure into queen consort. If those private letters hit the front pages, that entire public relations campaign would burn to the ground in a single afternoon. Edward was playing hardball. He immediately had the anthem tiara transferred into a high-security private safe guarded exclusively by his own independent security personnel. Nobody was going to touch it. The palace was backed into a corner, yet legal threats on paper were only the opening salvo. What happened next was not legal. It was fiercely personal. Around 4 o'clock that same afternoon, the double doors of King Charles's private sitting room inside Buckingham Palace swung open. Princess Anne walked in. There was no polite greeting, no protocol, no attempt to soften what was coming. Anne went straight for the throat. To understand why Princess Anne stepped into this fight with such fury, you have to look at how her relationship with Sophie had evolved. Years ago, back in 2021, Anne maintained a deliberate distance from the Edinburgh household. She is a woman who never fakes warmth. If she doesn't trust someone, she doesn't pretend to. Then came April 2021. Prince Philip passed away. The family was shaken to its core. In the months that followed, Anne and Sophie stepped up together to support the aging Queen Elizabeth. They worked side by side every single day. The cold distance dissolved into deep mutual respect. By the time of Queen Elizabeth's funeral, in September 2022, their bond was unbreakable. As they stood waiting for the coffin at Westminster Abbey, Sophie quietly reached out and placed a gentle hand on Anne's back. It was a small, unscripted gesture of pure comfort. So, when Princess Anne walked into King Charles's office on March 25, 2026, she wasn't just standing there as Edward's sister. She was standing there as the guardian of their mother's legacy. She looked Charles directly in the eyes. She told him that if he permitted his office to question, reclassify, or confiscate gifts bestowed by their mother, He would destroy the very foundation of his own reign. Then Anne delivered the line that froze the entire room. She said, "If our mother's signature on a lease or deed of gift is not worth the paper it's written on today, then your signature will be worth even less tomorrow." Pause and think about the absolute psychological power of that statement. A monarch's entire authority relies on the sanctity of their word. If Charles invalidated Queen Elizabeth's legal signatures to settle a petty palace grievance, he would render his own future decrees completely meaningless. He was undermining his own throne. Anne didn't stop there. She had already personally reviewed every contract regarding Bagshot Park. She knew Edward had paid millions out of his own pocket. She knew the Crown estate had accepted those funds under legally binding long-term terms. In her eyes, the real estate assault and the Tiara audit were the exact same dishonorable move. She saw what this was doing to Sophie. Anne had watched her father die in 2021 and her mother in 2022. She knew the profound grief of losing parents. Watching the palace try to strip away the physical memories left behind by the late Queen was something Anne refused to tolerate. And there was another ghost in the room, Princess Diana. Anne had been close to Diana. She had watched from the inside as palace aides systematically isolated Diana, stripped away her royal titles, and pushed her to the margins. She had seen a vulnerable woman destroyed by the institutional machine. Now, 30 years later, she was watching the exact same cold pattern play out against Sophie. Anne swore that history would not repeat itself. She dropped a nuclear ultimatum on the king's desk. She told Charles that if Queen Camilla's office did not immediately cease all audits and threats, she would take action. Not quietly behind palace walls, publicly. Princess Anne threatened to initiate a comprehensive, independent financial audit of Queen Camilla's entire household. Every expense report, every staffing allocation, every private budget item tied to Camilla's office. That threat carried massive weight. Princess Anne is widely respected across the globe for her ruthless financial discipline and work ethic. If Anne declared a household audit, Parliament and the public would believe every word. It would expose every hidden cost inside Camilla's operation. Finally, Anne addressed the quiet pressure being applied to Edward's children. Palace aides had been trying to force James, Earl of Wessex, and Lady Louise Windsor into private status earlier than planned, stripping away their security and royal protections. Anne shut it down on the spot. She declared that any decision regarding James and Louise belonged exclusively to Edward and Sophie, not to Queen Camilla, and not to palace committees. When Anne turned and walked out of that room, King Charles was left sitting in total silence. He was trapped between two impossible choices. He could support his wife's aggressive demands and face a public war with Princess Anne that would shatter his monarchical authority. Or he could surrender, overrule his own office, and accept that his mother's final decisions were completely out of his legal control. There was no clean way out. The king was waiting on the final, written verdict from his own legal team to see if he had any remaining ground to stand on. You cannot afford to miss what comes next. In the final chapter, I will reveal the official surrender document sent by the master of the jewel house late that night, the dramatic handwritten note Charles sent to Bagshot Park begging for peace, and the shocking new divide that permanently split the royal family into two warring factions. Subscribe right now, turn on your notifications, and click the video on your screen immediately, because the dramatic conclusion to this royal showdown is available right now. By the late hours of March 25th, 2026, the quiet legal warfare inside Buckingham Palace reached its final, unavoidable conclusion. I reviewed the confidential legal summaries delivered to the King's desk that evening, and the outcome was staggering. King Charles's own senior legal team had evaluated Edward's dossier. Their verdict was absolute. The Duke of Edinburgh's legal position was virtually unbreakable. Every covenant held. Every lease extension was ironclad. No royal order, no administrative review, and no monarchical prerogative could override it. Charles had lost. Think about the profound humiliation of that moment. For decades, Charles had operated under a firm belief. He believed that as king, he held ultimate control over royal assets, properties, and titles. His own lawyers had to tell him in writing that he was wrong. What Queen Elizabeth II had granted Edward was not a temporary favor. It was an unbreakable legal inheritance, completely beyond the king's reach. What hit Charles even harder was the revelation of his father's final move. The file contained the deathbed letter witnessed by Prince Philip. Charles knew his mother had always protected Edward, but he had no idea that Philip had formally sealed that protection in writing before he died. The late parents had outmaneuvered the reigning king years before he ever took the throne. Late that same night, the formal surrender arrived. A direct notice was issued from the office of the Master of the Jewel House to Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. It was short, cold, devoid of emotion or explanation. The note formally confirmed that the anthem Tiara would remain under Sophie's exclusive, private control. There was no apology for the audit, no acknowledgement of the psychological pressure applied to her, just a silent administrative retreat. Simultaneously, the Crown Estate audit into Bagshot Park was quietly dismantled. The official press statement buried the retreat under polished PR language, calling it a recognition of the Edinburgh household's role in maintaining the estate. But inside palace walls, nobody was fooled. The crown had backed down. Everything Prince Edward fought to protect remained intact. The title, the home, the tiara, all of it stood exactly where Queen Elizabeth II had placed it. Charles realized the official legal process had completely failed him, so he tried one last desperate move outside formal channels, a personal move. He sat down at his desk and wrote a private, handwritten letter. It was dispatched directly to Bagshot Park, asking Edward for a private family meeting. No lawyers, no advisors, just two brothers trying to reconcile. It was the move of a man who knew the law was against him. Edward's response arrived shortly after, and it was pure ice. Edward explicitly refused to meet Charles unless his full legal team was present in the room. I want you to appreciate the weight of that refusal. Edward was no longer acting like a younger brother seeking peace. He was acting like a man who understood the ruthless nature of the institution and refused to step into a room without legal protection. The era of family trust was dead. The formal record of this conflict will sit in the royal archives forever. Long after everyone involved is gone, history will record what happened on March 25, 2026. A claim was made by the Crown, it failed, and the institution was forced to admit its defeat in writing. But victories inside royal families come with an irreparable cost. The personal relationship between King Charles III and Prince Edward is permanently fractured. It is no longer personal. It is controlled, formal, and strictly limited to official duty. What the public will see going forward is a polished illusion. You will see unity. You will see brothers standing side by side on the balcony at state occasions. But behind those practiced smiles, everyone in the family knows the truth. They know that Edward had to hire contract lawyers to defend his family against the king. That knowledge cannot be erased. The internal power structure of the British monarchy has permanently shifted. Two distinct courts now exist within the royal family. At Buckingham Palace, King Charles and Queen Camilla continue to push their vision of a centralized, streamlined monarchy. But away from that center, a quiet, powerful opposition has formed. Princess Anne, Prince Edward, and Sophie. And behind them sits a crucial layer of silent support. Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales. They are not making noise in the press, but they have drawn a line. They are protecting the historic legacy built before them and refusing to allow it to be rewritten. For James, Earl of Wessex, and Lady Louise Windsor, this lesson will define their futures. They watched their father fight a silent, methodical war using documents and receipts. One day, James will inherit the Dukedom of Edinburgh, but he will carry that title with profound caution. He now knows that the institution that gives can also try to take back. That understanding creates vigilance, not blind loyalty. King Charles has his throne. He has his authority. But he no longer has the trust of the brother who stood quietly for decades and paid his own way. But the story does not end inside Bagshot Park. While Charles was suffering a humiliating defeat against Edward, an even larger, far more dangerous financial scandal was quietly developing behind the scenes at Prince William's Duchy of Cornwall. You cannot afford to miss what comes next. In our very next video, I will expose the classified financial ledgers leaked from the Duchy of Cornwall, revealing a dramatic secret confrontation where Prince William delivered a cold, three-word ultimatum to King Charles that threatened to shut down royal payroll entirely. Subscribe right now, turn on all notifications, and click the video on your screen immediately, because the explosive truth about Prince William's ultimate power play is waiting for you right now.